Most people believe the reason they never feel caught up is because there is simply too much to do. Too many responsibilities piling up constantly. Too many expectations from work, family, relationships. Too little time to address everything demanding attention. But that explanation, while comforting, is incomplete, because there are people with more demands, more pressure, and less time who do not feel this constant sense of falling behind. People managing larger teams, bigger projects, more complex responsibilities, yet somehow they don't carry that perpetual weight of incompletion, that persistent anxiety of never being done. So the question is not how much there is to do. The question is why the feeling persists, no matter how much gets done. Why you can work productively all day and still feel behind. Why completing 10 tasks doesn't make you feel caught up. Why clearing your inbox just makes space for the next wave of overwhelm. The amount of work isn't the variable creating this feeling. Something else is operating underneath the visible workload. The feeling of being behind is not created by workload volume. It is created by an open loop system you're operating within. A system where inputs are continuous and never stop arriving, where expectations are undefined and constantly shifting, and completion is never clearly recognized or marked. In that kind of system, progress does not register psychologically, because there is no moment where the mind is allowed to say, "This is enough." No clear endpoint where you can stop and feel complete. No defined finish line that signals you've done what needed doing. Just continuous flow of new inputs requiring attention, each one adding to the sense of incompletion. Each one creating another thing your mind tracks as unfinished. Think about how most modern work actually operates. You finish a task and immediately 3 more appear in its place. You answer an email and 5 more arrive while you were writing. You complete a project and the next one starts before you process the completion. There's no pause, no recognition, no moment of done. Just constant continuation into the next thing. Your brain never gets the signal that you finished something meaningful. It just registers that more things need attention immediately. So psychologically, you never feel caught up, because the system doesn't allow for the experience of being caught up. It only allows for varying degrees of behind, and your behavior adapts to this system without you realizing it. People begin checking more frequently for new inputs, switching between tasks faster to address multiple demands, starting more things than they finish because finishing seems impossible, reacting to whatever arrives instead of deciding what matters, not because they are inefficient or poorly organized, but because they are trying to close loops that were never designed to close, trying to reach completion in a system built for perpetual incompletion. Every new input creates another open loop in your mind, another thing to track, remember, return to, complete eventually. And human working memory can only handle a limited number of open loops. Research suggests somewhere between 5 and 9 active items. Beyond that, the system becomes overloaded and nothing feels manageable. But modern work environments routinely create dozens or hundreds of open loops. Every unread email is an open loop. Every project in progress is an open loop. Every conversation promising to follow up later is an open loop. Every idea you captured to explore eventually is an open loop. All of them running simultaneously in the background of your mind, creating constant low-level anxiety about what you're forgetting, about what still needs attention that you're not currently addressing. That background anxiety is the feeling of never being caught up. It's not about the actual amount of work. It's about the number of open loops your mind is trying to track. Modern environments amplify this problem systematically. Workflows are fragmented across multiple platforms and contexts. Information is infinite and continuously streaming from everywhere. Visibility replaces completion as the marker of productivity. You are rewarded for responsiveness to incoming demands, for presence and availability across communication channels, for activity and motion regardless of whether anything finishes, not for actually completing things to a meaningful standard. So the system quietly trains you to stay in motion instead of reaching completion, to be responsive rather than focused, to start many things rather than finish few things well, to maintain visibility rather than achieve outcomes. Because that's what gets noticed and rewarded. Completion happens quietly and often goes unrecognized, but presence is visible, responsiveness is measurable, activity is obvious. So people optimize for what gets rewarded. They stay in constant motion, always responsive, perpetually active, and feel increasingly behind despite all that motion. Because motion without completion just creates more open loops. More things started, more conversations initiated, more commitments made, all of which add to the mental load without resolving anything. The more aware you are, the worse this feeling can become. This seems paradoxical, but makes sense psychologically. Because awareness expands, what you can see faster than completion can happen. You see what you haven't done yet across multiple domains. You see what you could be doing if you had unlimited time and energy. You see what others are doing and compare your progress to theirs. All of that awareness creates perceived obligations. Things that feel like they should be done because you're aware they could be done. But awareness doesn't come with more hours or energy to address what you see. So the gap between awareness and capability widens continuously. Intelligence makes this worse because intelligent people see more possibilities, more problems to solve, more opportunities to pursue, more improvements to make. Each one becomes another open loop if pursued even partially. Another thing to track, another potential responsibility, another source of incompletion. So even as actual output increases through capability and effort, the perception of being behind accelerates because you're aware of exponentially more than you can possibly complete. And that awareness itself creates the feeling of falling behind. Most people respond to this feeling by trying to do more. Working longer hours, eliminating breaks, optimizing every process. Trying to increase output to match the endless input. But that approach fails because it doesn't address the actual mechanism. The problem isn't insufficient output. The problem is an open loop system that prevents completion from registering. You can double your productivity and still feel equally behind because the system just fills your increased capacity with more open loops. More things started, more responsibilities added, more expectations created. The feeling persists regardless of how much gets done, because the feeling isn't about volume, it's about system design. The advantage is not in doing more within the same system. It is in closing systems deliberately to allow completion to exist. This requires fundamentally different approach than productivity optimization. It requires defining what done actually means before starting anything. What does completion look like for this task specifically? What outcome indicates this is finished and doesn't need more attention? What criteria determine this is good enough to close? Without those definitions, nothing ever feels done. You can always do more, improve further, add another element. So the loop stays open indefinitely because done never arrives. But with clear completion criteria defined up front, done becomes possible. You reach the criteria and close the loop. Your mind registers completion and stops tracking that item. The open loop count decreases and the feeling of being behind reduces. It also requires reducing active loops instead of managing more of them. Most productivity advice focuses on managing more effectively. Better systems to track everything, better processes to handle more simultaneously. But that just makes you better at maintaining overwhelming numbers of open loops. It doesn't reduce the psychological weight of tracking them all. Better approach is limiting how many loops you allow to be open simultaneously. Finish things before starting new things whenever possible. Close existing commitments before making new ones. Reduce the active project count to what you can actually track comfortably. This feels restrictive because opportunities constantly appear, but every opportunity you pursue opens a new loop. And every open loop adds to the feeling of being behind. Fewer loops that actually close creates more sense of progress than many loops that stay perpetually open. It requires ignoring inputs that do not belong to a defined outcome. Most inputs arrive without your invitation or intention. Emails about things you never signed up for. Requests for attention on matters that aren't your responsibility. Information about situations you can't influence or aren't involved in. All of it creates cognitive load if you engage with it. Each thing you read, consider, or respond to opens a loop. So being selective about which inputs you allow in becomes critical. Not every email deserves reading. Not every request deserves consideration. Not every piece of information deserves processing. Most of it can be ignored without consequence because it doesn't connect to any outcome you're pursuing. Ignoring strategically based on defined outcomes keeps loop count manageable. You only open loops that serve purposes you've already committed to. Everything else gets filtered out before it creates cognitive load. Progress begins to feel real only when the system allows completion to exist. When you can finish things and have that completion register psychologically. When done is clearly defined and achievable instead of perpetually moving. When the number of open loops decreases instead of constantly expanding. That requires deliberate system design, not just better productivity within broken systems. It requires creating boundaries around inputs instead of trying to process everything. It requires finishing before starting instead of starting everything you see. It requires defining enough instead of pursuing endless improvement. All of which goes against modern work culture that rewards constant availability and unlimited ambition. But following that culture is exactly what creates the perpetual feeling of being behind, because that culture is built on open loop systems that prevent completion, that treat capacity as something to fill rather than something to protect, that value motion over outcomes and presence over completion. Operating in that culture without boundaries means never feeling caught up. No matter how much you accomplish, no matter how hard you work, the system prevents the psychological experience of completion, so the feeling persists regardless of achievement. Because the goal was never to finish everything demanding your attention. That was never possible and never will be. The inputs are infinite, the opportunities endless, the information unlimited. You cannot possibly address all of it, no matter how productive you become. The goal is to stop living inside a system where nothing ever feels finished, where every day ends with the same sense of incompletion, where accomplishment never registers as sufficient. And that shift does not begin with time management techniques or productivity systems. It begins with what you allow to remain open in your mind, which inputs you permit to create loops, which responsibilities you accept as yours to complete, which standards you apply to determine when something is done. All of that is within your control, even when the external environment isn't. You can't control how many emails arrive or requests appear, but you can control which ones you open and engage with. You can't control how many opportunities exist or projects are possible, but you can control how many you pursue simultaneously. You can't control what others expect or demand, but you can control which expectations you accept as legitimate obligations. That control is what allows completion to exist in your experience, what allows done to feel real instead of perpetually elusive, what allows you to feel caught up occasionally instead of constantly behind. Not because you finished everything, but because you closed your system to allow finishing what you chose.